Welcome to the Hey Church podcast. My name is Preston. I'm your host. And today we're talking about something really exciting. I think it's something exciting, at least because I geek out on business principles and leadership principles. So I hope you're excited about it too. It's something that is not talked a lot about in church life. I have not really heard this too much talked about in elders teams or church leadership. So I'm excited to introduce the concept and hopefully get the conversation rolling with more church leadership about what we're talking about today. Before we jump in, last week I recommended a book called Deep Work, which is a great book. I started a new book this week that I also think it's geared towards software companies and subscription-based companies, well, more towards tech. The guy's background is in technology. But it's called Crossing the Chasm. So I started reading it this week, and it's a great book. It talks about how to reach different markets at the different stage of your business. So when you're a startup, you reach market A, and then as your business grows, your customer starts to grow as well. So then market B is interested in your product. And the chasm is, how do you go from marketing or reaching your first type of customer to marketing and reaching your second type of customer? And again, I love applying business principles to the church world and understanding that in your church life as a senior pastor or a leadership team, as your church grows, you're going to start reaching different people. And are you crossing the chasm to take care of them? So when you're a church planner, you probably have a pretty young team. It's probably young adults. It's maybe a young family or two. But you got a lot of people who have free time because you need people with free time to plant a church. And then once a church is established, you start reaching new customers or new members. And so it's a dirty word to call members customers, but members for your church. And if you don't cross the chasm to start catering to those types and you just get stuck in church planning mode, then you're going to miss that. And that's the whole concept of the book is businesses fail because they miss the jump to their new audience, their new customers. So anyways, Crossing the Chasm, I'll add the description in or add the book name and whatnot in the podcast description. You can read that below and check it out. And if you have any book recommendations, please let me know. I love reading. I love learning more. So please drop those as well. So our topic that is super exciting that we're talking about today is churn, C-H-U-R-N. So if you've worked in business, you probably have heard this term before. Churn is a term for a rate. So we call it a churn rate. And it is the rate of people leaving your group. So either your product or services. So if you're a subscription-based company, you talk a lot about churn rate because that's how many people are going to stop using your product over a certain amount of time. And this is incredibly helpful to understand because you need to know how many people are leaving your product. Not everybody who signs up in January is going to be with you in December. And this is something that I don't hear talk a lot about at churches at the leadership level or any level at that is you might hear that, oh, so-and-so left, and then you just move on. That's really sad. That sucks that they left. But do we actually know how many people left this past year? And do we have a quantifiable number that we can take action on? Like how much exposure do you have to both how many people are leaving and how many people are coming? We get really excited about the overall, what's our net number? So this year we have a goal to reach X amount of average attendance or membership. But we need to know how are we going to get there? Is that a realistic goal? Can we achieve that based on our churn rate and based on our growth rate currently? Which one of those numbers do we want to change? All of that. So church churn is our topic today, and I think it's a really cool topic. We're going to jump into some formulas. So if you hate math, I'm so sorry. If you love math, you're in the right place. I'll put these formulas in the show notes as well. And then please research this as well. Just Google formulas for churn rate or for growth rate. So churn rate, again, is the rate at which users stop using your product, service, or in this case, leave your church. And There's a million different reasons people leave your church. There's life events. So if they have a kid or family member sick or a marriage or anything like that can take people away from your church community and they go to a new community, which is the best case. And then there's negative reasons that people leave churches. So whether it be offense or theological issues or worst case, they fall away from faith. So we'll talk about some of those later on. But those are just kind of the overall those are a few reasons why people possibly are leaving your church. And also, whenever we talk about church numbers, I feel like people get a little bit icky about it, because if you're a pastor, you care about the individual and you don't really care too much about the numbers. But I want to remind us that every number represents an actual person. And that's why I care about the numbers. That's why I want to help people, church leaders, understand these numbers as well. Because for every person, every number represents one person coming into your church, whether they be saved or unsaved, and their ability to hear the gospel and for the gospel to be spread is represented by numbers. So that's why we care. There's people who have to care about the numbers too. So anyways, getting that off my chest. So churn rate. Let's go into the first formula for figuring it out. So your churn rate is your lost members divided by your starting members, and then times that by 10. So this is your most basic churn rate. So let's say we lost 10 people this year. So that's 10, and we started with 125, for instance. And then I'm going to divide that number by 100, and that gets me the whole number of 8. So 8%. My churn rate is 8%. That means for every 100 people over a 12-month period, I'm going to lose 8 of those. You can do this for any time period. All you have to do is find out how many people you had at the start of the time period, how many people you had at the end of the period, and then subtract that number. So in this case, that would be, if I lost 10, that means I would have 115 at the end, and then I would have 125 at the start, and then get that number of 10. So again, I'll put this formula in the show notes so you can look at it and see it. So an 8% churn rate means that I'm losing 8% of whatever I started with at the beginning of the year. So for church leaders and elders teams, as we're setting up projections for the year or a time frame, it's good to know how many people are we actually going to lose over that time frame, and then step back and make your big decisions. So that could really have financial implications, that could have ministry implications, that could have a bunch of different implications. So it's really important to know what your churn rate. Another useful, so if you want to step up this formula, is to get your annual churn rate. This one takes into consideration actual growth as well. So this one is how many members lost over your time frame divided by how many members you started with, plus how many members were added over that time frame. So again, if we're going to use a year time frame, let's say members lost was 10. So if we lost 10 people over 1 year, and then let's say we started with 125 and then we added 5 people. So now I combine those two numbers, and we're going to take members lost 10 divided by starting plus added, which is 130. And then you're going to get 7.69%. So 10 divided by 130 gets you 7.69%. So you can, that tells us that our actual, by the end of the year, we're going to lose 7.69, and that takes into consideration how many people we grew. So that's your annual churn rate. The final kind of numbers we'll talk about, and then I'll kind of get into more of the practical what and how to fix it, is your growth rate. And this one is really helpful to know because it's on the opposite side of the spectrum. It's not how many people you're losing, it's how many people you're adding, which is a much more fun number to look at. And your growth rate is simply what's your current number divided by your past number, and then subtract 1 to get to your percentage. So if currently we have 130 people, and then last year we had 125 people, divide those by each other, minus 1, you're going to get 4%. So we had a 4% growth rate over the past year. So that's a great number to know. Now let's talk about it more. Why is this so important? Well, you're losing people. That's why it's important. So in business, we talk about the number of people lost, your churn rate, really, if that number is too high, especially if that number is higher than your growth rate, then that shows us what our runway is as a business. That means that if we don't change anything, we might be dead in 5 years. And that's really important for churches as well. This is kind of a downer of a topic, but it's real that if you're not adding people to your church and you're losing people, then your church is on the decline. And that has really significant ramifications, because that could mean you have to close your doors, or that means you need to make a significant adjustment to the church to make sure that you can change your trajectory. So it's important to know how many people are we losing every year versus how many people are we gaining every year, as that will help identify the health of the church and your runway as a church. Again, this number really helps you with projections. So if you have a goal that the church wants to grow by X number in X amount of time, you can now find out, is this an achievable goal? And if we do want to achieve it, what numbers do we need to change? Do we need to change our churn rate, or do we need to change our growth rate? Now, what are the roadblocks with the churn rate? Well, it's growth and retention. So your churn rate, if we look at that second formula we use, that includes added users or added members over that time frame. So if your churn rate is pretty high, it's probably because you're not adding a lot of users as well, or members. I keep using the term users because I'm used to subscription model business, but I mean members. And so if your growth rate isn't high enough, that means your churn rate is going to get higher and higher. And we need to both increase the amount of people that are coming through, and then on the other side, and what churn rate is mostly associated with, is retention. And as we talked about at the top of the podcast, there are many reasons that people leave the church. When you understand your churn rate, you can understand what our retention rate is as well. That's a better term sometimes to use, is what's our retention rate. So if you know that you have people coming into the church on a regular basis, but you also know that the church isn't growing, then you probably have a pretty high churn rate without a high growth rate. And so you have visitors coming in, they might stay for 2 to 3 months. And that means that in that time period, you're going to have a high turnover, high churn rate, which means very low retention of these new people, which means you don't have a high growth rate. Now, that is a great thing to just identify right off the bat, is if your problem is retention, but you have people coming in, then you can fix that pretty easy. And you fix that by understanding what are the needs of those people coming in. So here's a few ways to get started with this. Is first, find out what your churn rate is. So if you have a database, whether you use Tidely, Breeze, Avanto, Planning Center, any church database, go in and find out how many people do we have at the start of the year. You can even do it year to date. We're about to end the quarter, so you could do it for this first quarter of 2023. Go in and find out how many people do we have at the start of this time period, and then find out how many people do we have now, and then find out your churn rate. You can also do this for the past year if you want to start with what happened in 2022, do a bit of a reflection time. Once you find out that number, and again, if you have a church database, which we highly recommend you do, put names to these numbers. If you're a church under a couple of hundred, then you probably, either yourself or somebody on your team, have a personal relationship with these people who left over that time period. So find out the number and then put names to those numbers. Again, numbers are so important because they have names. And then find out what are the reasons that people are leaving. So it could either be practical issues. So if you find out that you had a lot of young families leave and their kids were about 10 to 12 years old, then you might find out that people were leaving because your church doesn't have a youth group. They might be going to another church community because that community has a youth group. And that's a super important information, because now you know that to retain those people, to keep them a part of your church community where they were already plugged in, where they didn't have to make new relationships, where they were growing and healthy, not that they can't be healthy somewhere else, but you're getting the idea. is all you need to do is add a youth group. And I say all you need to do because obviously there's a ton of things that happen when you build a youth group. But now you know where to start. If you want to retain those people, if you want to grow your church and grow with your people over long periods of time, you need to find out what are the needs that your church needs to meet for them. Another couple of reasons are maybe people were leaving just out the back door. People just kind of left for no reason. That speaks to a community issue. So maybe you don't have a strong small groups. You're not building strong enough community where people can just get out the back door. That's a great thing to identify as well. Maybe people are leaving because of offense or some other personal issues there. That's a pastoral issue. So do we need to beef up our pastoral team? Do we need to have an avenue where people can reach the pastors better? There's a ton of different reasons people leave. Go ahead and with your team, find out how many people are leaving with your churn rate, put the names to all those numbers, and then brainstorm how to serve them better in the future. Again, with the book that I recommended at the top of the podcast, Crossing the Chasm, it's all about how do you reach the new level of where your church is at. As your church grows, you're naturally going to go through the life cycle. As your senior pastor gets older, they're going to attract older people in their life stage. When they're young and have kids, they're going to attract young families. When their kids graduate, they're going to attract parents who have graduated kids. It's just natural that typically, your senior pastor reflects whatever the demographic is going to be in the church. So the demographics usually going to be maybe just one step below whatever your senior pastor is. And so that's a good indicator that, hey, let's beef up another area. That way we're filling the gap that our senior pastor can't fill, because your senior pastor cannot do everything. And if you're a senior pastor listening to this, let that be a little freedom. You can do everything. Get the team around you to help retain that. So I hope this helps. Start by getting your churn rate, figure out where these people are going, why they're leaving, and then figure out how can you retain them more? How can you engage them more? And again, it's so important because it helps grow the individual. It helps grow the church, which helps grow the kingdom on the earth. And it's so important. Everything you do in the church is so important. And look, here at Hey Church, if you need help building community, if you need help connecting with your people, you can head over to heychurch.co. You can set up a demo with us. We'll talk you through a couple of strategies and the best way to communicate with your team. And also, if you're a listener of this podcast, you can get 25% off. So when you check out, when you sign up for your subscription, enter the code podcast25. You'll get 25% off your subscription and you can get started today. It's that easy. We'll see you next week.